I wasn't looking for giant footprints when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the anomalous construction timelines of certain 19th century exhibition halls in Europe, specifically the way several of them appear to have been built faster than the documented labor forces could have physically managed. That was the thread I was pulling. A quiet architectural mystery buried in civic records and forgotten municipal ledgers. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would upend anything. Then I found a photograph. It was filed inside a secondary archive at a regional historical society in Cape Town, South Africa. Not the main collection, not the digitized catalog, but a physical box of unsorted prints from an estate donation made sometime in the 1940s. The photograph showed a research team of 7 men standing around something embedded in a granite outcropping. They were small in the frame. Whatever they were standing around was not. The caption on the back read simply, "Paluzzi Basin, 1912. Do not circulate. Do not circulate." I held that photograph for a long time. I turned it over twice. I looked at the faces of those 7 men. Serious faces, dressed in the formal expedition wear of the early 20th century, and I tried to understand what kind of discovery prompts someone in authority to write those 3 words on the back of a photograph and then place it in a box that wouldn't be open for decades. That single image sent me down a path that took nearly 3 years to follow properly. What I found along the way was not a simple geological curiosity. It was a pattern, deliberate, repeating, and suppressed with a consistency that official explanations began to collapse under the moment I examined them closely enough. I don't have definitive answers, only questions. But the questions, once you hear them, are very difficult to unhear. The most significant piece of physical evidence in this entire investigation is something that technically anyone can visit. It sits in the Paluzzi region of South Africa, near the border of Swaziland, in a granite formation estimated by Geological Survey to be approximately 200 million years old. The formation is called, informally, the Goliath's Footprint, though that name itself is a kind of institutional concession, a way of naming something without acknowledging what the naming implies. What exists, there's a depression in solid granite. It measures approximately 1.2 meters in length. The shape is unmistakable. 2 raised ridges at the front suggest toes. A wider depression toward the rear suggests a heel. The depth and distribution of pressure within the impression follow the exact biomechanical logic of a bipedal footfall. Weight concentrated along the outer edge, slight forward lean toward the ball of the foot. These are not random erosion patterns. I consulted the published work of 3 separate forensic podiatrists who examined photographic records of formation, and all 3, independently, used the same language, consistent with a footprint impression. The official geological explanation is wind and water erosion, differential weathering of the granite matrix. And I want to take that explanation seriously for a moment, because it deserves to be taken seriously before it is dismissed. Granite does erode. Differential weathering does produce unusual shapes. I am not disputing the chemistry. What I am disputing is the physics. The impression at Paluzzi sits on an angled surface, approximately 27 degrees from horizontal. Wind erosion on an angled granite face does not preferentially carve bilateral symmetric depressions that replicate the pressure distribution of plantar contact. Water erosion follows gravity. It runs downhill. It does not pull symmetrically in the shape of 5 forward-facing toes and a heel with the precise biomechanical weight ratios of a walking stride. The grain of the surrounding granite, when examined in the highest resolution photograph available from a 1912 expedition, the ones I was eventually able to source from a private collector in Johannesburg, shows no radial weathering pattern extending outward from the depression. There is no erosion halo. The surrounding rock is intact. The shadows in the 1912 expedition photographs fall correctly. I mapped them against solar positioning data for that region in late autumn, which is when the expedition records indicate the photographs were taken. The depth suggested by shadow angle is consistent with the measured depth reported in the expedition notes, approximately 7.5 centimeters at the deepest point, near the ball of the foot. These photographs predated the technology to fake them with any precision. The expedition equipment was standard field documentation gear. The men in those photographs were not performing a hoax. Their institutional affiliations, 2 were attached to the Geological Society of South Africa, 1 to a British Colonial Survey office, would have made public deception professionally catastrophic. And yet by 1914, the expedition's formal report had been reduced to a single paragraph in a regional survey publication, described as an interesting natural formation of no geological significance. The lead researcher, a Dr. Cornelius Vermick, published nothing further on the subject. His correspondence from 1913 onward, held in partial form at the University of Pretoria, contains a gap of approximately 14 months. Letters simply missing from the chronological file, as if someone removed them with a specific intention of leaving no record of whatever those months contained. But the Mpuluzi Formation is only the beginning, because once you begin looking for this category of evidence, bipedal impressions in ancient stone that are far too large for any known human, you find it is not isolated. You find it is not even rare. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In the Paluxy River Basin of Texas, near the town of Glen Rose, limestone formations dating to the Cretaceous period contain impressions that have been debated by researchers since the 1930s. The officially acknowledged dinosaur tracks at this site are genuine. I am not disputing that. What I am drawing attention to are the secondary impressions found adjacent to certain dinosaur trackways, impressions that measure between 38 and 45 centimeters in width and show toe differentiation inconsistent with any known theropod foot structure. Researchers from the American Museum of Natural History visited the site in 1938. Their internal memoranda, partially available through a Freedom of Information request filed in 2009, describe anomalous primate-consistent impressions requiring further investigation. No further investigation was officially published. In Ain Dara, northern Syria, at the site of an Iron Age temple complex, built sometime between 1300 and 740 BC, there are 2 footprints carved into the basalt threshold of the main sanctuary. Each measures approximately 1 meter in length. They are not decorative. They are not stylized. They show the same plantar biomechanics as the Mpuluzi Formation: bilateral symmetry, 5-toe differentiation, heel depression. The official archaeological literature describes them as symbolic divine footprints, a ritual motif indicating the presence of a deity. That interpretation is convenient. It is also entirely circular. We are told they're symbolic because they are too large to be real, and we know they are too large to be real because we assume they must be symbolic. In the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh, India, limestone cave systems contain a series of impressions documented by British colonial geological surveyors in 1879. The survey report, filed with the Imperial Records Office in London, describes foot-shaped impressions of unusual dimension measuring between 60 and 90 centimeters in length. The report recommended further study. The further study never came. The original survey documents exist. I have seen copies, but the follow-up expedition that was supposedly dispatched in 1881 left no records whatsoever. Not a single field note, not a single photograph, not a single report. In St. Petersburg, in the collections of the Kunstkammer Museum, Russia's oldest museum, founded by Peter the Great, there are catalog entries from the 18th century referencing bones of unusual dimension recovered from Siberian territories. The catalog entries exist. The bones do not. Listed as transferred to an unspecified research institution in 1923. That year again, we will return to 1923. The same formations, the same dimensions, the same institutional response across continents, across centuries, across languages and cultures that had no contact with one another. Buenos Aires, Delhi, Nairobi, the river valleys of central China. The evidence surfaces and is noted and then quietly disappears into archives that are difficult to access and easy to ignore. Who were they built for? There's a name that appears on maps from the 1700s. Serious maps, cartographic documents produced by the foremost geographical institutions of Europe that have been almost completely erased from modern historical consciousness. That name is Tartaria, or, in its fuller form, Tartaria Magna, Great Tartary. Not a legend, not a myth, not a speculative territory drawn from travelers' tales. a named, bounded political entity appearing on maps published by French cartographers, Dutch trading companies, and British imperial survey offices throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It covered a territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia into the Siberian Far East, an area larger than any single nation that exists today. It was described in contemporary European accounts as possessing cities, roads, administrative structures, and a population of considerable size. And then it simply stopped appearing. Not conquered, not renamed, not gradually absorbed into surrounding nations through the slow process of historical change that we can document with treaties and battles and administrative records. Erased. The maps changed. The territory formerly labeled Tartaria Magna became a collection of regional designations. Siberia here, Turkestan there, Mongolia somewhere else. And the unified political entity it had once described was never explained, never eulogized, never historically accounted for. Why does this matter for giant footprints in stone? Because the regions where the most significant suppressed impressions were documented, Siberia, Central Asia, the territories that were once Tartaria, correspond precisely to the areas where the maps go silent. The British colonial surveyors documenting impossible footprints in India were operating at the eastern edge of where Tartaria once appeared on maps. The Russian geological expeditions that quietly filed anomalous bone reports were operating inside what was formerly labeled Tartaria Magna. The expedition records that disappear after 1923, that year specifically, are disappearing from territories that, a century and a half earlier, carried a different name entirely. The connection becomes impossible to ignore. Whatever Tartaria was, whatever political reality that name represented, it was large enough and organized enough to appear on the most sophisticated cartographic documents of the pre-industrial world. And it disappeared from the record with a completeness that requires active explanation. Natural historical decline leaves traces. Conquered empires leave records of their conquerors. Absorbed territories leave administrative transition documents. Tartaria left almost nothing, and what it did leave was quietly moved into archives that the 20th century chose not to examine. The footprints in stone are part of that same silence. The newspaper record is where the suppression becomes most legible, because newspapers, unlike institutional archives, were published in thousands of copies and distributed across cities before anyone could decide that their contents were inconvenient. And in the newspaper record of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, giant footprints are not rare. They're almost ordinary. The Cape Argus, Cape Town, 1912. Expedition team reports remarkable stone formation near Mpuluzi bearing striking resemblance to human foot impression of extraordinary dimension. Geological explanation awaited. The Illustrated London News, 1897. Correspondent from Colonial Survey reports discovery in Andhra limestone of foot-shaped depressions measuring upwards of 2 feet in length, origin unknown. Museum authorities consulted. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 1903. Quarry workers near Antelope Springs, Utah report uncovering stone slab bearing impression consistent with Sandale human foot embedded in Cambrian trilobite layer. Smithsonian representatives dispatched to examine. The Sydney Morning Herald, 1911. Geological Society member describes formation in Queensland sandstone bearing characteristics of bipedal foot impression, length estimated at 1.4 meters. Formation to be examined by University of Sydney faculty. The Buenos Aires Standard, 1918. Formation discovered in Patagonian sedimentary rock described by accompanying geologists as bearing unmistakable resemblance to foot impression of unusual scale. Photographs forwarded to Buenos Aires Natural History Museum for assessment. 5 separate newspapers. 5 separate continents. 5 separate decades. And in every case, the same sequence follows. A discovery is reported, institutional authorities are notified, and then the story disappears. Not retracted, not debunked with counter-evidence. Simply never followed up. The Smithsonian representatives dispatched from the 1903 St. Louis report filed no public findings. The University of Sydney faculty assessment of the Queensland Formation was never published. The Buenos Aires Natural History Museum photographs have not been located in any catalog search I have conducted. After 1923, the newspaper reports stopped entirely. The photographs stopped. The geological field notes stopped. The references in institutional correspondence stop, not gradually, the way interest in a topic naturally fades. Abruptly, a line drawn across the calendar. Before 1923, the record is imperfect but present. After 1923, it is as if the entire category of evidence simply ceased to exist. The Smithsonian Institution's connection to this pattern is not incidental. Multiple researchers attempting to trace physical specimens, stone samples, plaster casts, photographic negatives, that were reportedly sent to Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century have found the same answer. No record of receipt, no record of storage, no record of disposition. The specimens are simply not there. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence carefully and follow it to its logical conclusion. What if the footprints are exactly what they appear to be? Not metaphors, not erosion, not ritual carvings. Actual impressions left by bipedal beings of extraordinary physical scale who walked across surfaces that were at the time not yet stone, sediment, volcanic ash, cooling mineral deposits, and whose impressions were preserved by the same geological processes that preserved dinosaur tracks, that preserved trilobite trails, that preserved the delicate imprint of fern leaves in carboniferous coal measures. We accept those impressions without difficulty. We put them in museums. We build interpretive centers around them. We teach children to press their small hands next to the handprint of a dinosaur and feel the scale of deep time. But the moment an impression suggests a bipedal primate of unusual size, the institutional response shifts from curiosity to erasure. Why? The answer, I think, has less to do with what the footprints are and more to do with what their existence will require us to reconstruct. If beings of that physical scale existed, and I am not speculating about their nature, only about the logical implications of the evidence, then the architecture begins to make sense. The massive stonework, the doorways scale beyond human proportion, the halls that echo because they were built for something that produced more sound, the tools that are too heavy, the furniture that is too large. These are not anomalies if you accept the premise. They are evidence of a consistent pattern of physical scale that runs through the archaeological record and has been systematically reassigned to mythology because the alternative requires dismantling too much of what we believe about our own history. And that is why 1923 matters. That is why the reports stop. That is why the specimens disappear. Not because the evidence wasn't real, but because by 1923, the institutional framework for managing inconvenient history had matured enough to operate quietly, efficiently, and without leaving a paper trail that any future researcher could easily follow. The question isn't whether they existed. The question is what their existence tells us about who built the world we inherited. They don't debate the footprints. That is the first thing I noticed when I began attempting to engage with academic literature on the subject. They don't issue formal refutations. They don't convene panels. They don't publish systematic counter-analyses of the photographic and geological evidence that has accumulated across more than a century of amateur and semi-professional documentation. They simply pretend it never existed. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. I have contacted 4 university geology departments with specific questions about the Mpuluzi Formation and its pressure distribution characteristics. 3 did not respond. 1 responded with a form letter directing me to a Wikipedia article. I have submitted freedom of information requests to 2 major natural history museums regarding specimen transfer records from before 1930. Both responses cited incomplete historical cataloging as the reason for the absence of records. Incomplete cataloging that, conveniently, affects precisely and only the category of evidence I was asking about. This is how passive erasure works. It doesn't require conspiracy in the dramatic sense, no shadowy meeting, no signed agreement to suppress the truth. It requires only institutional culture. It requires that the right questions never be rewarded with tenure, never be published in peer-reviewed journals, never be attached to funding applications that get approved. It requires that the researchers who find inconvenient things learn quickly that inconvenient things end careers. And so the evidence accumulates in private collections, in unsorted archive boxes, in the hands of amateur investigators who lack the institutional authority to force anyone to take them seriously. And the disciplines reinforce each other's silence. The geologists defer to the archaeologists. The archaeologists defer to the anthropologists. The anthropologists defer to the historians. And the historians say that what is not in the written record did not exist, ignoring entirely that the written record is itself a product of decisions about what to write down and what to leave out, what to preserve and what to quietly allow to decay. I have spoken with 3 researchers. I will not use their names, because 2 of them asked me not to, who encountered evidence of this kind during legitimate institutional research, and were explicitly told by senior colleagues to redirect their attention, not threatened, not disciplined, simply advised, with the collegial firmness of people who have learned where the boundaries are, that this was not a productive direction. The advice was given kindly. It was followed. The evidence was filed away, across disciplines, across countries, across centuries. The same quiet instruction. Look elsewhere. There is one more category of evidence that I need to bring into this investigation, and it comes from a source that surprised me. Not from geology, not from archaeology, but from the auction records of estate sales conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Britain, Russia, and the United States. In those records, which survive in reasonably complete form at various auction house archives, there are recurring entries for a specific category of object. They are described variously as stone impression specimens, geological curiosity blocks, and, in one 1887 Christie's catalog entry, natural stone formation bearing foot-like impression, Provenance Central Asian Expedition, 1884. The Christie specimen is described in the catalog as measuring 94 centimeters in its longest dimension. The sale price was listed. The buyer was listed as a private collector, whose name I have been able to trace to a known associate of the British Geological Survey. After purchase, the specimen disappears from the record. The measurements in these auction catalog entries are specific and consistent. The specimens range from 60 centimeters to just over 1.2 meters in their longest dimension. The descriptions consistently reference bilateral symmetry and toe-like anterior projections. The provinces cluster around the same regions: Central Asia, South Africa, the American Southwest, Northern India. The dates cluster in the same window, 1870 to 1921. Museum acquisition labels from this period, where I have been able to examine them, describe similar specimens as natural erosion formations and geological curiosities. The labels do not attempt detailed explanation. They categorize and file. The Smithsonian's own internal description protocol for this category of specimen, documented in an administrative memo from 1908 that I found referenced in a secondary institutional history published in 1962, instructs catalogers to classify foot impression formations under erosion anomalies. No further study indicated. No further study indicated. Stamped on the file. Printed on the label. Whispered across the table to the junior researcher who is asking too many questions. I have found 17 auction catalog entries matching this description across a 50-year window. I have found references to at least 9 museum specimens that match the physical characteristics. I have found records of 4 separate geological expeditions that explicitly set out to investigate specific reported formations and return with specimens that were then classified and stored without further publication. And suddenly the Mpuluzi Formation isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I keep returning to that photograph. The 7 men standing around the granite outcropping in 1912. Their serious faces. The 3 words written on the back. Do not circulate. Why would you write that on a photograph of wind erosion? Why would you instruct a geological expedition to silence its most significant finding? Why would newspapers on 5 continents independently document the same category of discovery and then collectively fall silent within the same narrow window of years? Why would the Smithsonian Institution create a specific administrative protocol for classifying foot impression formations under a category explicitly designated for no further study? Why does 1923 function as a wall in the documentary record, not just for this evidence, not just in one country, but across institutions, across disciplines, across languages and archives that had no reason to coordinate unless something or someone gave them a reason? Why do the regions where the most significant impressions were found correspond so precisely to the territories that once carried the name Tartaria on the most sophisticated maps of the pre-industrial world? Why do the measurements stay consistent? 60 centimeters, 90 centimeters, 1.2 meters, across centuries and continents, as if whatever made these impressions was a real and relatively consistent physical phenomenon, rather than a random geological accident repeating itself endlessly across the planet. Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies. Pattern. And pattern implies something that produced it. Pattern implies a source. Pattern implies that the world we have been handed, the history, the timeline, the careful accounting of who lived where and built what and how large they were, is not the complete picture. That something was here before the version of history we are permitted to examine, that the evidence of it is still in the stone, still measurable, still photographable, still sitting in granite outcroppings and limestone caves and unsorted archive boxes, waiting for someone to ask the right questions without being advised to look elsewhere. I don't know what we have forgotten. I don't know what was erased in 1923 and in the decades surrounding it. I don't know what those 7 men were looking at with their serious faces in the South African Granite Basin, and I don't know why someone decided the world should not be allowed to see it. What I know is that the stones still hold the impression. Whatever made it, it was real enough to compress solid granite, real enough that 7 educated men in formal expedition were stood around it and said nothing publicly for the rest of their lives. Real enough that it required 3 words on the back of a photograph, and then decades of deliberate silence to contain. The stone remains. The footprint remains. And the question of what walked across this world before our version of history begins, that question remains too.